Hello everybody and welcome. I hope my face isn't blurry. It might be. Today I'm going to do the hardest video that I've ever done. I've failed at this video so many times. I get like 10 minutes in, lose my train of thought, can't dig myself out of it, and then start over. So I probably won't even release this. Today we're going to talk about Nietzsche and the death of God. I want to go at it from an angle of what the real world is, and then the way that we filter the real world, and then maybe what Nietzsche was actually talking about. I'm barely smart enough to even talk about this. Actually, I'm probably not smart enough to talk about this. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying. I'm really not even going to talk about Mormonism today, probably, but we'll try our best. Okay, today, to kind of get started, I'm going to go over some basic neuroanatomy, and then we're going to talk about how your behavior is produced from the structures going on in your brain. And this isn't a free will thing. I'm not saying there is or isn't free will. I'm just talking about the definition of behavior as it relates to action potentials and neurons and what's going on in your nervous system, okay? This is the second video I've kind of done on the nervous system. You guys are going to be pros. I mean, all 7 of you who watch my videos are going to be total pros at, I shouldn't say all 7 of you. I appreciate every person who watches this. If you're not a subscriber, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Someone would even say smash the subscribe button. But whenever people say that, I think, what did the subscribe button ever do to you? You know, like, don't just go around smashing things. What are we playing, a Rampage World Tour? So... all right, so right, neuroanatomy. Let's talk about what a neuron is. Let's talk about what it does, and then let's talk about how that can create or not create behavior. So very important, and I'll say this from the very beginning. Neurons can only say one thing. They can only say yes. Okay? Neurons speak in binary code. They can only speak in zeros and ones, okay? Now, when something touches you, and if it's enough stimulus to warrant like you actually feeling it, I know that's a complicated way of saying it, but like if something touches you and it touches you hard enough that you actually feel it, that means something. That means that the neuron that's right there, the neuron that's in your nervous system that's out at the end, its little dendrites, which look like little fingers, its little dendrites feel something. And then each little dendrite, think of dendrites as little fingers or little like tentacles or something like that. I'll back up a little bit. So let's talk about what neurons look like and then how that influences everything down the chain. So a neuron, most neurons kind of look like a scorpion a little bit. They're like halfway between like a scorpion and a squid. So they have a whole bunch of fingers. They're called dendrites. Tentacles, fingers, legs, whatever you want to call them. Most neurons have a lot of dendrites. Some neurons have only one dendrite. All neurons have at least one dendrite. Okay, are we happy? So dendrites, they look like little fingers. The dendrites, so imagine that this is a dendrite, right? So it feels the stimulus and it's being bothered a lot. And so it's saying, hey, there's something here, and it's running down my finger, and it's trying to tell the soma, the cell body, hey, there's something going on out here. But here's the thing. It's only happening on 1 of 5 dendrites. And so that's not going to be enough unless it's extremely vigorous. It's not going to be enough to cause something called an action potential, which is where... this is a weird way to explain it, but you know when you go to your toilet and there's that lever and you push, and you're just pushing as softly as you can, and eventually it hits a point of no return where it just is going to flush now? Think of that as an action potential, okay? So this is such a weird video already. So it's slowly pushing, right? And eventually there will be enough stimulus in this dendrite to potentially cause an action potential. And what the action potential does is just a bigger version of what's going on right here. So it'll say, oh yeah, we need to say yes to this. And so it will send yes down this thing called the axon, and it will come down to this thing called the axon terminal, which sometimes looks like a weird little like spider web. It doesn't matter. Imagine it as a line with some little like roots coming out of it or something. Little tiny short roots, not big legs like we see at the top of the dendrite. Okay, so eventually it will say there's definitely something here that is stimulating, and so we need to send this down the chain. And so now if we were to imagine that there's some form of stimulus that's hitting all of these and it's hitting them a lot, that's going to be a quick action potential. And it's going to say, oh yeah, there's something here for sure. We need to send it down the chain. And so they'll send it. It will leave the axon terminal and it will hit right on the end of another set of dendrites on a different neuron. Okay, and it's just going to start that process all over again. So imagine that something falls on your hand, right? It's raining. You're outside, you're sitting on a chair. It's raining. Some water hits your hand. You immediately say, oh my gosh, a drop of rain just landed on my hand, right? Well, in order for that to happen, the neurons in your nervous system had to notice that stimulus, send it up the chain, tell your brain that it's there, and then maybe you will say, oh, I don't actually want to get wet today, and you'll take your hand away, okay? So all of that happens in like 0 seconds flat, right? It's a very, very quick process. And that is the way that your neurons communicate with one another. Now, to feel that something is wet or to feel that something is heavy is just a different frequency of them saying yes. Okay, but it's always them saying yes. And the reason that it's important that I get this point across, that they only say yes, is because in order for a dendrite or in order for a neuron to say no, it means that they are silent. It means that they don't trigger an action potential. And so your brain, this is where it starts to get pretty wild. There are like billions of neurons just in your brain, okay? And some of these neurons can have as many as 50,000 dendrites that are all touching the axons of different things. Very, very and I know I'm not a genius, okay? And I'm not gonna get everything right here, but think of your brain as a big computer that's kind of like all interlocked with itself. That's just like, it only says yes, and the different frequencies determine what the action then is, okay? What the action that you then take, or this is heavy, this is hot, this is cold, this is wet. It's just a different frequency of yes, okay? So now this is mind-blowing to me, because I would think about this as like the internal workings of a computer, right? So your brain in this sense is a lot like a computer. It's just zeros and ones. Now imagine if you had to use a computer and you didn't have any way of interpreting these zeros and ones, right? You're not a programmer. You don't know what they mean. You can't read it. You're just looking at a screen of zeros and ones and you're thinking, yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing here. Meanwhile, if somebody knew how to read that, they would see that you were in like Microsoft Word or that you're on YouTube or something like that, right? So what the guys who are so famous for kind of bringing computers to the modern era, they're famous for adding this filter in between the hard, the cold zeros and ones, the cold binary, right? They're famous for creating a filter in between that and ourselves so that we can actually see what's going on the computer, we can interpret it, and then we can act accordingly, okay? So now imagine the way that, for example, everybody who's watching this has probably used an Apple computer at some point in their life, and then they've probably used a Windows computer at some point in their life, right? And the thing that's going on, I know I'm going to get some hate for this because I actually know like very little about computers, but the thing about those two computers for me is that it really is like the user facing, like the interface of the computer that's so different, because underneath it, I mean, you hit Z and Z is what you type, right? You do a mouse click and you select the thing that you're clicking on. Like computers are very, again, I know that computer programmers are going to hate on me for this because I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm guilty and I know that. But the interface that you are interacting with is actually the thing that's important. more so than the binary code behind it. And that is also what's going on in our brain. So we have all of this stimulus, we have all of these things that are then producing actions, but as it's going on, we are narrating to ourselves, we are communicating with ourselves, we're kind of going into dialogue with ourselves about the meanings behind the things that we're doing and the implications of the things that we're doing. And so I want to draw a hard line between maybe this binary world is what I'm going to call it, right? The cold world that you actually inhabit, that is probably just best described as nature, okay? And so nature has its rules, right? Survival of the fittest. If you're sick, then you probably, like, nature isn't going to do you any favors. Nature isn't going to try and keep you alive. Nature is a brutal, cold place. It doesn't really give a shit about how nice somebody is, how good they are. In nature, to be good is to be strong, and to be bad is to be weak. It's not so much that there's good and bad in nature, it's that there is strong and weak. Okay? So that's this cold kind of binary zeros and ones world that we live in, okay? However, on the other side of our brains, and I'm not speaking about hemispheres, I'm just saying on the other side, we have this place where stories take place, right? This place where stories imbue what we're doing with meaning. So let's use the example, you're on the road, you're in the car, right? You take a right turn, okay? In this cold nature world, you haven't done you've taken a right turn, big whoop. That's what you did, right? But in this world over here, you are one step closer to going to visit your girlfriend, or you're closer to work, or you're late for work, or you're going to see your mom, right? So like this story is adding context and meaning to the little things that you're doing that the natural world would say doesn't matter, it's not important. Okay. So I'm kind of building up a dichotomy here. You have the cold natural world, you have the warm cultural world, okay? And I am going to call this culture. So we have nature and we have culture. And maybe one day we'll get into the idea of how this cultural bubble grew up and became God. Maybe we won't. I don't know. So you have these two worlds that you're living in simultaneously, okay? And now this is where Nietzsche comes in. Humanity on a grand scale started to have similarities across these cultural bubbles. One of those similarities was that we all saw ourselves as children of some sort of God who cares about us, who wants us to be happy, and who wants us to do things to serve this God, okay? Now, I want you to put yourself a couple hundred years in the past, and we're right around the time that Nietzsche said that God had died, okay? Nietzsche declared the death of God. He did this in a book called The Gay Science in 1882, I think. So it's 1882, and Nietzsche says, I think God is dead. And what did he mean by that? So Nietzsche was most likely influenced by Darwin's book on the origin of species, which had come out in 1859, something like that. Roughly 20, 25, 30 years before Nietzsche's book. Okay. So, and Nietzsche wasn't that old when he released this book. Nietzsche died fairly young of syphilis. And so Nietzsche was living in this world where this absolute bomb had just been dropped into everybody's cultural bubble. We all had this idea that the thing that imbued our behavior and actions with meaning was that there was a God who had commissioned these actions, there was a God who had commanded these actions, and that there was a God who would reward us for these actions. It was a it's still a very common idea across the world. Okay, it's not an old idea. I mean, it is an old idea, but it's not an idea that's totally gone. But Nietzsche and a lot of other people looked at what Darwin was saying. And what Darwin was saying was, all of these stories that we've been telling ourselves about the ideas and the motivations and the implications of our behavior, it's not what we think. It's something else. We were created by nature. We were created by natural selection. We are a process of evolution. Not everything in our body has a purpose. We're not in the image of God. The chin, for example, nobody can figure out what our chin is for. It's been called a spandrel, an evolutionary spandrel, I don't even know how many times. Okay, and a spandrel, for those of you who don't know, imagine a bridge made of arches. So, or imagine like two arches, right? You have a bridge with some arches, and you have an arch here, and you have an arch here. I'll probably just put a picture on the screen, but you have an arch here, and you have an arch here. And you have this space that's in the middle of them that's kind of like an upside down triangle. That's not the goal, okay? That's not the goal of putting archways next to one another. That's just something that happens when you put two archways next to one another. So at this part of the video, you're probably asking yourself, what do spandrels have to do with the death of God? You might also be wondering, hey, well, why are you not wearing that hat anymore? It looks like it's nighttime. You're wearing different clothes? Like you're wearing different clothes now? Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, this was a hard video. So this is me from the future finishing the video. The whole point of this spandrels conversation that I'm now having with myself on some weird lonely corner of the internet is all of Darwin's work fundamentally changed the filter that humanity was using before to understand and view the world and reality. And so when Nietzsche says God is dead, he's in a very, very poetic, in a very, very artistic way, he is saying we used to be using Windows computers or Apple computers or Linux. Does anybody use Linux? We used to be using this, and now we're using something else. We used to use myths and stories that revolved around a supreme creator who loved us and cared about us and was all-knowing. We used to filter everything that we perceived through the lens of there's a creator who is willing this to happen or allowing this to happen. And all of that changed the moment Darwin wrote his book and basically said, we were actually creations of nature. Darwin essentially said, we are not at least directly products of God. We were created through this process called evolution. And so the way that we knew ourselves before, it suddenly wasn't us anymore. Every filter that we were used to using before was no longer relevant because of this new information. So the reason that I see a correlation between Friedrich Nietzsche and the death of God and Charles Darwin and his work is because Nietzsche would have been 15 when Darwin released this book. I remember when my dad got his first cell phone. Like I was right on the cusp of that kind of like technological advance. And I imagine that it was just like he had like a Motorola Razr, and then iPhone was released, and then it was just, I mean, now we are where we are, right? Everybody has an incredible piece of technology in their pocket at all times. Well, I imagine that Darwin and his book and his thoughts and all of the discoveries that he made, the whole theory of evolution during those years was probably an even more explosive bomb that changed culture entirely. And so when Nietzsche said that God was dead, he was in a very artistic and poetic, because Nietzsche was a poet, in a very poetic way, he said, we used to be looking through this filter, but we now understand that that's not the correct filter. And with the death of that filter goes the death of this metaphysical worldview that had been insulated and kind of procured for the culture at the time. And suddenly it was like all of a sudden all of humanity was no longer using a Windows computer. They were now using a Mac computer. The interface was different. There was nothing about it that was the same. We went from myths and stories about God being the source of explanation for everything to there is now a scientific, materialistic explanation for everything. That's a massive shift in mentality. And that has broad effects on the culture. And so there it is. There's the death of God, right? Nothing is unexplainable anymore. There is no God of the gaps because we are making every gap smaller. And that's a crazy thing to diagnose so quickly after it happened. Giving Darwin his due here, explaining a few ways that maybe this filter shift, this paradigm shift, could still be affecting us today, or maybe just new ways to think about phenomena in the world. If human beings are created through the same natural processes that birds were created, or wolves or bears or what have you, if we're like birds, okay, birds have instincts once a year. It's that time of the year when they're flying south. And that's an instinct of theirs. And it's been baked into them by years of survival. Their species does better. They survive longer if they go where it's warmer, right? It's perfectly obvious. Well, human beings have instincts too. And sometimes I wonder if we've become so intelligent, so cognitively complex, that simply saying, oh, well, I want to have a family because evolutionarily speaking, when you reproduce, you come full circle with the circle of life, and suddenly you're meeting the ends for which you were born as a species. We have this desire we feel complete, many of us, when we get married and have kids. And because we don't like to just say, well, of course we do, just birds fly south in the winter and human beings reproduce, right? That wasn't satisfying to us. And so maybe religion has stayed because it feels better to say that I do this because I have a Father in heaven who also did this and has asked me to do this. And when I do this, I get to feel how much he loves me. Just a thought. There's, we have this, human beings have this instinct to group together and kind of tribe off and, feel like we are a part of a bigger whole. In evolution, it was necessary for us to live in these groups because many minds are better than one. We can find more food as a group. We can ward off more predators as a group. There is strength in numbers. And so having your tribe, if you're a hunter-gatherer, having your troop, if you're a chimpanzee or a bonobo or what have you, having your troop or your tribe is going to help you live longer. So again, that's success in terms of evolutionary terms. Well, it's not the case anymore that we have to have a group to survive. You can live in one state and you can have an online job in a different state, and you can have all of your groceries delivered, and you can watch TV and play video games and be entertained. We don't need the troop anymore, but we still want it. And so, in a sense, politics is becoming, or religion, or for some people, politics is their religion, religion is maybe sticking around because we want to feel slightly more important than just a bird flying south. And so hopefully my ramblings make sense. But I think that Nietzsche diagnosed something in a really, really beautiful way. And he saw all of this. And phrasing it as God is dead is just so stark, and it's so awful. And so it feels very profound, and like that is the end of things. And I want to dig into this one thing really quickly. These new atheists all over the internet who think that they're so smart because God is dead. In my opinion, it's not hard to figure out that there's no God. But it is hard to figure out how to have a meaningful life if you've been taught your whole life that your meaning comes from a God. And so if somebody needs a myth to live their life in a way that they see as meaningful, then that person is not stupid. They're just different than you. And it's frustrating to me as a person who would consider themselves an atheist that we would write off the Bible or any other religious text because it didn't happen. Because Breaking Bad didn't happen, but it's probably one of the most impactful stories that I've ever watched. And it's made me second guess myself a lot. And it's made me question the kind of person I want to be, even though it didn't happen, right? And so I think that we need to tread very carefully when we parade around the fact that God is dead or that God doesn't exist. It's just some food for thought. Thank you for watching. Don't smash the subscribe button. Press it nicely, like a friend, like a firm handshake, but a firm subscribe. Very low energy today, but I whatever. If you liked what you heard, let me know in the comments. I'd love to chat with any of you. I'm in the middle of school right now, so making videos is pretty hard, but I'll make them as often as I can. Yeah, take care, everybody.